I listened to the Joe Rogan podcast where Steven Pinker was the guest. Pinker is a psychologist who has recently published a book about why rationality matters. Okay, this sounds great until you realize that what Pinker means with being rational is that you never question the mainstream narrative.
Whereas some of the climate deniers, they're like well-prepared litigators. They can find every loophole. They know every study. A good lawyer can argue against anything. What does predict your acceptance of climate change is just where you are on the political spectrum. The farther to the right, the more denial. Jeffrey Epstein was murdered.
You don't think he was murdered?
I don't think he was murdered.
Really?
Yeah.
Why not?
Well, it's just a simpler theory that he would. He had every reason to kill himself. He had the means. I think it's much easier to believe that a bunch of prison staff were incompetent. Say, well, how do you convince a real QAnon believer that there isn't a cabal of Satan-worshipping, cannibalistic pedophiles in the Democratic Party and Hollywood?
In the basement of a pizza house?
In the basement of a Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria. And, of course, new babies are being born all the time, and they aren't born believing in QAnon or chemtrails or 9/11 truther theories. And some of them can be peeled off by rational arguments. I think it's not tried enough, including in issues that I strongly believe in, like human-made climate change, like safety and efficacy of vaccines, and on and on. I think.
Well, you get the point. The foundational belief of the so-called skeptic movement is to never question a mainstream narrative. To justify this position, he and other skeptics repeat the phrase, "Don't attribute to malice what you can just as well attribute to stupidity." They say this shit like it's some form of law of nature. The argument is similar to Occam's razor, that the most simple explanation has the highest probability to be true. The reason for this is that the theory that require a bunch of made-up reasons, or ad hoc, of why this is still true, even though evidence has pointed to the contrary, the complexity of this theory increases, and thus the probability of all of these things being true at the same time decreases. But the logical fallacy that the skeptics make is that they assume that this simplest explanation has to always be the case, when in reality, the principle just gives the simpler explanation a higher probability to be true. And in some cases, the conspiracy theory is actually a simpler explanation than the mental gymnastics necessary to keep up the official narrative.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 19 men armed with box cutters directed by a man on dialysis in a cave fortress halfway around the world using a satellite phone and a laptop directed the most sophisticated penetration of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, overpowering the passengers and the military combat-trained pilots on 4 commercial aircraft before flying those planes wildly off course for over an hour without being molested by a single fighter interceptor. These 19 hijackers, devout religious fundamentalists who like to drink alcohol, snort cocaine, and live with pink-haired strippers, managed to knock down 3 buildings with 2 planes in New York, while in Washington, a pilot who couldn't handle a single-engine Cessna was able to fly a 757 in an 8,000-foot descending 270-degree corkscrew turn to come exactly level with the ground, hitting the Pentagon in the budget analyst office where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had announced missing from the Pentagon's coffers in a press conference the day before, on September 10th, 2001. Luckily, the news anchors knew who did it within minutes.
Osama bin Laden.
The pundits knew within hours.
Osama bin Laden.
The administration knew within the day.
Terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
And the evidence literally fell into the FBI's lap.
That a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
So instead of being skeptical towards both the official narrative and the conspiracy theory, people like Pinker are selectively skeptic towards only the conspiracy theory, and that is intellectually dishonest. One other argument that Pinker made up is that people who believe in conspiracy theories do not really believe in them in the same way as they can be certain that their car won't drive if they run out of fuel.
The question is, how committed are you to a narrative being true in the same sense that there's gas in the car is true or false? Right. And I think that people, when it comes to stirring, interesting, meaning-giving narratives, they don't insist on that kind of proof. I think there is an attitude that some people have, probably a tiny minority of humanity, that you should only believe things for which there's good evidence.
Here, Pinker fails to make the distinction between belief and suspicion. A belief is when you are really sure that your car will not drive if it runs out of gas, which is rational. But it's also rational to be suspicious about the rattling noise it makes in the engine. Maybe you can still drive the car on your cross-country road trip, but out of self-preservation, it is important to be suspicious that stuff can go wrong, and you need to have your phone charged just in case, even though you believe that you will be able to make it. In here lies the problem with taking Pinker's advice, that if your burden of proof is too high and you thus become less suspicious, you will become too trusting towards people who might be conspiring against you.
The Jeffrey Epstein story is a real conspiracy.
The death, yeah.
Everything, the whole thing, the fact that he really did do that, the fact that he really did get let out of jail with a very, like, he was a convicted pedophile, and he got out. He got out very easily. He had a very light sentence.
What Joe Rogan doesn't know here is that Steven Pinker actually helped Jeffrey Epstein to get away with just a slap on the wrist for child sex trafficking, and conveniently Steven Pinker doesn't point this out. But you can see that he becomes really nervous.
Case is crazy when you see how many people he flew to these islands.
Yeah. I mean, I had the tremendous misfortune of knowing Jeffrey Epstein because I knew so many people at Harvard, at MIT, at Arizona. I mean, he had, you know, again, had the tremendous misfortune of knowing some of the people he was tight with.
Did they fly you out to the island?
No, did they fly me out to the island?
Yeah.
Oh, I wouldn't have set foot on this island in a million years. But I did. But before any of this stuff came out, I did fly on his plane once to TED in Monterey. Yeah, guy, and even then, I thought this guy is a fraud.
Really?
Yeah, I never.
Why'd you think he was a fraud?
Because he pretended to be an intellectual peer of the people whose company he was buying. He's a faker.
Shit.
That was my reaction. I could never stand him. I couldn't understand why. I had 5 different colleagues who were in tight with him. You know, to my tremendous disadvantage, because it meant that, you know, people would snap pictures, and there I would be, you know, in a crowd with this sex criminal. One of the worst things that has ever happened to me.
Was this post his being convicted?
There was one that was post. Most of them were pre. But one of them was, you know, I was at a convention that he paid for, scientific conference, and the organizer said, "Oh, you know, will you? Can we put him at the same table?" And then someone snapped a picture. And that's, you know, all over the internet, and it's one of the banes of my existence.
Maybe it's not a great idea to fly out on an airplane with a shady billionaire named Jeffrey Epstein, who you think is a fraud and have no idea where he got his money. Then you help him out in court to get out of child sex trafficking charges with just a slap on the wrist. And then later you go on a conferences that is sponsored by this now convicted child trafficker and get photographed in his company. But you see, this is where rational thinking gets you. Wouldn't it have helped Mr. Pinker here to be a little bit suspicious? He couldn't prove that Epstein was a honeypotting pedophile, but your suspicion should be enough to not associate with people like that. This is the shit you will end up in if you're a binary thinker like Pinker, meaning that since you can't prove to 100% that Epstein was a shady character, you assume that he is squeaky clean, even though your gut feeling is telling you that his behavior is incongruent and something is wrong. So the take-home message of this video is, when you hear the stupidity over malice argument, know that it's a lazy argument used by skeptics because they do not want to challenge their worldview. Be skeptical towards both the conspiracy theory and the official narrative. And taking Pinker's advice will make you an easy target for nefarious actors that prey on people's good intentions. Thank you guys for watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe and also like the video, because YouTube cares so much about small creators like myself. You can't leave a dislike anymore. So what I say is automatically correct now. See you in the next video.